We are on. Welcome, everybody. Thanks for tuning in once again to another interview of My Jewish Story. Today we have an extraordinary one with, it's written James Wagman, but we might get around to this conversation. But as he joked, his name is Yaakov. Or Jim, but James is also an alternative. And so this is Jim/James/Yaakov Wagman. And Jim, so glad you are here to talk with me. At first, I remember we were like hesitant, but now you're here and I'm so appreciative and delighted. So welcome.
I've been in Annapolis for just 2 years. And I was born a long time ago in a distant galaxy far away. The first 10 years of my life were spent in a small town in Wisconsin. And the last 10 years before coming to Annapolis were spent in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So I've had a kind of affectionate a feeling for Wisconsin teams, including the Milwaukee Bucks and the Milwaukee Brewers. That's from Miller Park in Milwaukee.
Right. That's very, you know what? I could not agree more with trying to sneak in a little bit of at least Milwaukee Bucks because they just won the basketball championship. So I totally support getting the name in once or twice. So
and
wow,
this is great. Are on top of the, yes.
Go ahead. Let's finish what you're saying.
No, the Brewers are on top of the Central Division of the National League at the moment. So,
all right. Well, I have to become a little bit better at following baseball then. Mm-hmm. They had a Jew on that team. His name was Yelich, I think. I think he's Jewish. So, I know Ryan Braun. Excuse me, Ryan Braun.
Ryan Braun, yes,
definitely a
correct.
Jew.
Yes,
definitely a Jew.
Yes.
So, all right, maybe that's the perfect way to start. You said you were born in Wisconsin?
No. I was born in a distant galaxy a long time ago. My first memory, my second oldest memory is when I was 4 years old. And it comes from what was Poland then. My mother was carrying me on her back out of the ghetto of Lvov. And this was May of 1943. And she was carrying me on her back. I think I was suffering from typhus. I was ill. And as she carried me through a plank, there was an open plank in the closed ghetto. She took me through the plank. And as I looked back, I could see several bodies hanging. And I asked her, why are these necks so elongated? I didn't realize there were corpses that had been hung there as punishment, I suppose. Anyway, so she took me through this plank and escaped. She said that within the next month, the whole population of the ghetto was shipped to the Janowska death camp and killed. So that's my second memory.
So this was just outside of Lvov, you're saying?
We were living in Lvov. It was in a ghetto of Lvov, and she escaped through this plank, this large wooden plank that was in the fence surrounding the ghetto.
Oh my God! And you actually have, a memory, albeit vague, because you were so young, but still a memory of this.
That's my second memory. Yes. So after a few weeks. Yes, I'm sorry.
I was going to say, when your first one was seeing the people hanging?
No. My first memory was when I was 3 years old, and it's very vague, but I remember my mother telling me to stay in bed and stay asleep. This was in, let's say, March of 1942. And as she said later, we were living in the ghetto with my father, my grandparents, several other people, and there was a roundup. It must have been Jewish auxiliary police who were asking people to go to be registered. And my mother told them that I was a little child, I was asleep, she couldn't go, and that her grandmother, my great grandmother, was too old to go, and so we couldn't go. So they didn't want to make a big fuss about it because they didn't want to have, let's say, riots or fears. And so all of the other people, including my father and my grandparents, my mother's parents, were taken away, and they were immediately taken to the Belzec death camp. My mother, so that's my earliest memory, so it's about 3 years old.
Oh my
Uh,
God. And your
my
father,
mother found,
you said your
yes,
mother carried you, but was that with your father?
no, he had been taken away in March of 1942.
Oh, I see.
So
Now
this
I,
was a
of course,
year
now I
later.
understand.
This was a year later.
Oh,
Later, she found out that her parents were uh, beaten to death at the train station. She found this out from a thief in Hungary, and thief was a kind of a honored profession, sort of like the thief of Baghdad. And so this thief told her that they had been beaten to death at the death camp. But I presume that, I mean, sorry, at the train station before they got on the train to Belzec. But I assume that my father and his mother were taken and died
oh,
there.
this is, I mean, you have a firsthand memory, albeit vague, young, but a firsthand memory of this,
Yes,
which is
yes.
now so unique and so important and so painful and raw on many levels, too.
So after a few weeks, I don't know exactly how long, we got on a train going to Krakow, um, where my father's sister was living. She was married to a Ukrainian medical student, and she was living in Krakow under false papers. Anyway, we got on this train, and see, I've always believed very much in intuition, and I recall my mother, a small 5 foot tall woman. She had a kerchief over her head, looked like a Polish country woman, and there were German soldiers on the train. And I remember getting up and walking to them and playing with them. And I did this sort of consciously. Um, and so anyway, we got to Krakow. Nothing happened. The intuition always has to be tested by experiment and reason. Anyway, we got to Krakow, and we were with my aunt. And I had been suffering from typhus. Somehow, my um, aunt's husband was a medical student. He was able to get one of the first groups of typhus treatments, sulfa drugs to treat the typhus, and I was able to recover. I don't remember that much about it, but I remember my mother telling me when I was examined by the doctor, tell him that you're afraid to pull down your pants. And he must have realized what the situation was, but he didn't pursue it. And I got the sulfa drugs and I recovered.
Oh, because of
And
the circumcision, is what you're saying.
yes,
Ah,
exactly, yes.
that, and so this was in 1944.
43,
Oh, still
43,
43.
43. Still 43 because we were there a few weeks after we got out of the ghetto. And then my aunt somehow obtained false papers, let's call them Aryan papers, identifying us as Polish Catholics, I guess. And we went on a train to a place where we were supposed to cross the Carpathian Mountains into Slovakia. Um, my mother tells me that there were 7 or 8 other pretty well dressed Jewish people. And when we got to the end of the train station, all of them got out on one side and were immediately arrested by German police or soldiers. And we got out on the other side. And we were met by the guard who was supposed to take us across the mountains. And he said, my mother, according to my mother, what am I supposed to do? There's only one. There was supposed to be 7 or 8 people. But finally, he took us to his to his mother's home, and she was crying over us and commiserating with us and awfully sad. And then he took us to the midpoint of the mountains, crossing into Slovakia, the Carpathian Mountains, and put us in a cave to wait for the Slovakian guides from the other side. The He lighted a fire, and so some of what I've said is from my mother's memory, but I do remember the fire, and I do remember wild boars with their eyes outside of the cave looking in, but afraid of the flames, and so nothing
This,
was done.
unbelievable. Wait a minute, but let me ask a quick question.
Yes, please.
When you, how did, I don't even know how to ask this. What made you get out of the train on the other side? Was that something that you were told to do,
Coincidence.
or intuitively you said, "Oh, they're going that
No,
way,
that was
maybe"?
my mother's choice. My mother's choice. It
But
was not my choice.
it was a choice, not like she wasn't, because everyone else was getting out on the other side. You're saying all of the
Yes,
people who you thought you were going with, right?
yes, yes,
And
yes.
she kind of somehow got a little nervous and went the other way.
She got out for some reason. It's coincidence or chance. I think that's all one can say.
Or maybe
Yes,
it was she had a suspicion. But
I can't take.
wow, that's incredible. But nonetheless, they all were arrested or taken to the camps.
They all were arrested. Yes,
You, on the other hand, managed to sneak away, and now you're in a cave with a fire, and
and
the Boers aren't
we were in
getting
a
you,
cave.
and the
And the
Slovakians.
next
Good.
the next day, the Slovakian guides came and took us across to the other side. We came to a camp. I remember they took the one toy that I had, which was a brass elephant. They must have thought it was gold flecked and maybe gold, and so they took it. And my mother and I went into Slovakia and ultimately into Hungary. Slovakia abuts Hungary, and we went to Hungary. And I know that my mother kept two books. One was we were under Arian papers or false papers. One of the books was a small prayer book inscribed by Pope Pius XII to the Polish refugees, to the Polish refugees from Poland, which had been occupied. And the other book was a German translation of Kipling's Jungle Books, and she would read me that, and it had a few illustrations, but she read me that, so that was the one story that sort of shaped my childhood at that point. She would read me that very, very often. The
And
books.
these books were given to you by the Polish authorities. Or no, excuse me,
Uh,
by the what is it, the Hungarian authorities?
the must have been given by refugee organizations,
Right.
Polish refugee organizations.
Got it.
Yeah.
So your first memory of prayer was praying out of this Christian prayer book given to you
Yes.
by
Yes.
some authority. We're not sure
That's
which
true.
one,
That's
and
true.
but definitely with the inscription of Pope Pius on it.
Oh yes. Yes. Oh,
Now I'm
my
learning.
mother
Now
had
I know much more about you, Jim. Now that I know that your initial imprint of prayer was done with Pope Pius's blessing.
that.
Um,
Well, let me tell you a little bit about my mother,
tell me.
um, about her background. Um, See, we were all my mother and also my father's parents were born in Lvov. Uh, Lvov was a large cultural city, about 500,000 people, with parks and an opera house built in the style of Vienna because it's part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And uh,
You know what's
I'm going
interesting?
to
Sorry for interrupting you really quickly. Is that
sure.
I am there's a great sadness that I have that you weren't a part of our community a little bit earlier because a number of years ago he passed away, probably I think now 7 or 8 years ago, but he was a doctor in town. His name was Dr. Joseph Thaler, Taler. His wife passed away a couple years ago. Her name was Branka, but he also came from. He pronounced it Wolf, almost like there was
Yes,
an F at the end, like Wolf, Wolf.
yes,
But
yes.
not that was just how I heard him, but nonetheless, he was from Lvov also, and has uh, different stories for sure than you do. Everyone has a different story, but some similarities. But most specifically, that he was from the same town. So I wish that you had had the opportunity to meet him because he was kind of he was an extraordinary man as well. Keep going. Sorry for interrupting you.
So it was a large metropolis, part of Austria-Hungary. Um, Many years later, I'm sort of going to jump ahead
Yeah.
because many years later, in 2006, my wife, that's my second wife, and I were in the Vatican museums in Rome.
Mm.
And we were walking, going with a tour to the Sistine Chapel. Before you get to the Sistine Chapel, there's a room, and there was a huge, huge painting on top of it, and everybody's looking up, and so I'm looking up at the painting, and I see that uh, on the one side is the Polish flag and the Polish knights with the cross on their banners. And on the other side is the Turkish army,
Hmm.
and with the Turkish, the crescent moon and the star on their banners and their curved swords. And I realized that this is a Polish historical painting by a painter named Matejko, and it describes the relief of the siege of Vienna in 1683. It was a Polish king, Jan Sobieski, who relieved Vienna, and the Viennese were so uh, happy at this that they took the crescent moon and they made croissant. They made so that
The
when
pastry.
you get your croissant at Whole Foods at Starbucks, you're not getting French food, you're getting Viennese food. Made in honor of the great victory, the relieving of the siege of Vienna by this Polish king.
Right. That's one of the. I mean,
And
they talk about. I know Bernard Lewis refers to that victory in Vienna as
yeah,
perhaps the turning
yes.
point of the greatness of the Muslim Empire.
So this was in 2006. My wife and I were there, and I mentioned this to my mother, who was alive, and she said, that painting was in Lvov. It was in there was a park with a trade fair buildings, and that was there, and I would see it every time that I went to that park before the war.
Wow.
Apparently, it was given by the Polish government to the Vatican when Poland was invaded by Russia in 1939. They
Wow.
didn't want it to fall into the Russian hands, and so it was given to the Vatican, and that's where it is right now.
Wow.
Um,
That is incredible. That's an incredible story. So, where are we? Can we go back to 1943 a little bit? Is that where we
let's
still
go
are?
back. Actually, we'll go back a little bit further because my mother was an only child. My father had five siblings.
Hmm.
So my mother's father owned a shoe store. She always said a middle class shoe store, not a high class shoe store. Anyway, he owned this shoe store, and
That's where I
she
would have
went to a
shopped anyway. I would have shopped there.
she, she went to a Zionist gymnasium. That's a high school. The language of instruction there was Hebrew. They were trying to get people to go to Palestine. This is in the 1930s. They were
Right.
trying to get people to go to Palestine and training people for that. So the language of instruction was Hebrew. Um, my mother said people spoke all kinds of languages. I mean, so they spoke German, they spoke Polish. The language of instruction here was Hebrew because they were trying to get people to go to Palestine. As far as Yiddish was concerned, my mother said you don't study Yiddish, it just comes out of your mouth. And so, of course, she understood Yiddish, and I could understand it and speak it to some degree. Um, anyway, she
How
went to
many
this
languages do you
gymnasium,
speak right now? How many languages can you
probably
speak?
maybe three. I mean, German, Polish, some Russian,
All right, so we'll give you four.
some
I,
Yiddish, some Yiddish.
there you go.
Um,
It's
the,
because so many people who are from Europe or it's only in America in which be having two languages is is something significant. When you are from anywhere else but America, you have the capacity to speak multiple languages. At least it seems that way to me.
See, my stepfather, who did not have any education beyond second year of high school, he spoke German and Ukrainian and Russian and Yiddish, of course.
That's right.
In other words, there were many people there who spoke different languages to get along.
Yeah.
Um, so anyway, my mother was in this gymnasium, this high school, and she said the most brilliant student in the gymnasium was a man named Adam Schaff. She remembers in 1939 when the Soviets invaded Eastern Poland that he was riding in an open truck with he was a communist, and they were cheering the Soviet invasion. Anyway, he went back. He became a lawyer. He went back later to Russia during the war and returned and ultimately became a professor of philosophy, but also a member of the Communist Party Central Committee, the ruling body in Poland. And he was in the Central Committee until he was kicked out after the 1967 war when all of the Jews
Hmm.
were purged from leading positions in the Communist Party. So there were various students there. In fact, I think that my mother's father wanted to go to Palestine and establish a factory there with a partner, but the partner got a better deal in some provincial town in Poland, and so the deal fell through, and they didn't get to Palestine.
Hmm.
Um, they didn't
So
get to Palestine.
yeah. So tell me. So
Um,
how did you? I guess maybe I'm fast forwarding a little bit, but I don't want to skip over anything which is too important. But can you tell me a little bit about how you then managed to how you found your way to Wisconsin?
yes, I don't immediately want to go there because I want to tell you something about my mother's school years.
Okay, go ahead.
But the way we got to Wisconsin is it. See, my father's brother uh, uh, did go to Palestine. He ultimately became a bus driver for Egged. His fiancee went and became a nurse at Hadassah and became head nurse at the emergency center of the Hadassah Hospital in Jerusalem.
Wow.
And I saw them there years later, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a moment. Well, so they went there to Palestine, but my parents uh, did not.
Right.
Uh, my mother and father did not.
Right.
And after finishing high school, my mother was out of school for 2, 3 years. She wanted to go to university, but Jews were not allowed into the technical and scientific fields like pharmacy or medicine or such.
Right.
And then, according to my mother, they were building a large new pharmacy school and center. And so they provided an opportunity for people to contribute a brick, they called it, a certain amount of money. And so and she said maybe 20 other Jewish students were allowed into the pharmacy and medical programs on the basis of paying this kind of bribe. And the lectures in the first year, the freshman year, were joint lectures for the medical and pharmacy students. The Christian students, the Polish Christian students, all sat on one side. The Jewish students all sat on the other side, except for one Polish Christian woman who ostentatiously sat with the Jews. Now, my mother says that Jews were not allowed into the technical schools. They were allowed into history and the arts and such. And if a person was converted, there were no obstacles. For example, one of the professors was a man named Bober, who changed his name to Bobrański. And he always wore a large crucifix. And another one was called Tenenbaum. He changed his name to Tenetsky. And a third man was called Parnas, and he didn't change his name. So if people converted to Christianity, there were no obstacles to their career. In fact, this Bobrański actually ultimately enabled my mother to get the certificate of her pharmacy graduation over to the United States, and she was able to, she had to take 1 year at the University of Wisconsin to validate her education. But I'm sorry, I
Yeah, I'm
can't hear
sorry.
you.
My audio is off. I'm so sorry. I was just didn't want to make. How did she get? W- was she? How did she get into the pharmacy school if she was a Jew, or was she working under false papers?
No, it was it's this sort of this contribution, this brick they had to pay, maybe 20,000 zloty, or I don't know how many dollars that would be. I don't know how many zloty or how many zloty is the word for gold,
Right.
the
But did she
currency.
mean if you paid this, then you were able to work around
There
the
was
rule?
one time, it was a one-time thing because they were building a new faculty at the university in Lvov.
I see.
Yes.
So they made
And now
exceptions for people who gave money.
that 1 year. So there
Right.
were people who had gone to pharmacy school in Czechoslovakia, which was only a 2-year school, and they were admitted in, and some medical students were admitted in just that 1 year. Um, the one occasion that I thought I should mention in regard to this Professor Bobrański, by the way, he converted, he wore this crucifix. He wanted to he fell in love with a Polish student and wanted to marry her. And she said that she would not marry him because she was afraid that their children would all have payas, the forelocks. The in other words, that they'd be born with Jewish forelocks, and um, he stayed. Anyway, one time, uh, my mother says it was Yom Kippur, but I think it must have been around Easter. Polish fraternity students would carry large poles with nails in them, and they would attack the Jewish students. And so the Jewish students, including my mother, all fled into the office of this Professor Bobrański, and he locked the door and wouldn't let them in, and they stayed there for several hours. My mother says at one point she didn't want to stay there any longer, and she went out. They were surprised that she was leaving the office, but young, innocent-looking woman, and they let her out, and she went home, and nothing further happened. And then I guess so. Anyway,
What
this
another
professor,
example of extraordinary good fortune on your
yes,
mom's part,
oh yes, yes, yes,
because
yes,
the train, now this. I mean, she survived a couple times.
yeah.
Keep talking. Tell me
Well,
more.
I sort of left it at the point where we got to Hungary. We were in southern Hungary at a small town called Kecskemet, and we were under these Aryan papers. We were provided it, but we were living at the home of a rent in a home of a Jewish woman. Once a day, we had some metal containers, and we went to get food, soup, and maybe a meat dish and something else at a um, place that was provided for us. At one point, this woman told my mother that they were being sent somewhere else, and would she keep the apartment for them until they came back? Well, the landlady was Jewish. They were all shipped out and they never returned. And in other words, this was the group, let's say, that were being taken that were organized by Eichmann to be sent to Auschwitz. All of the Jews were sent away, and of course, we were not Jewish. We stayed there and survived. But the next memory that
You
I
weren't
can
Jewish because you
recall,
had false papers.
we had false papers. Yes, yes, yes. Um, the next memory that I sort of recall, I must have been maybe 5 or 6. Let's say it was early 1945, probably. So I would have been 6 years old. And it's the Russian troops coming in. Hungary was invaded by the Russians, and these troops were going through the small town of Kecskemét, a town of about 80,000. They were ransacking people's homes, because these were middle class homes, and they were taking possessions and such. And I remember walking with these Russian soldiers, and they looked at me as a friendly little child. I remember seeing a purse, and what did I know? I said, maybe my mother would like this kind of purse. And I picked it up, and somehow a Russian must have taken it away from me, so I was never able to bring it to my mother. But I didn't realize what they were doing. They were just ransacking all these homes because they assumed that the middle class people were just the enemy, the bourgeoisie, and these were people who had resisted the Russians. So we were in
Wow.
southern, this is sort of towards the end of the war, and we left somehow, which I don't remember too much how, through into Austria and into Vienna, which was sort of divided into 4 zones like Berlin was later. And carrying one suitcase, my mother and I sneaked over into the American zone and escaped from the Soviet occupation. Um,
Amazing. Amazing.
we ultimately wound up in a DP, a displaced persons camp near the city of Linz. It was a camp that had been established as a working uh, class group of apartments under the Nazi regime, I guess. The place was called Bindermichel. And that's where my mother met my stepfather. Um, his family was from the Drohobych-Borislav area of of um, eastern Poland. He was born in Drohobych and grew up in Borislav. He had a wife and a son about my age, and they were hiding in a bunker, which was discovered by the Germans, and they were killed.
Oh,
But he was sent to a camp. He was sent to Mauthausen, the Mauthausen
mm-hmm.
concentration camp. He was a mechanic. He was sent to the Mauthausen camp. He worked pretty closely and knew very well Simon Wiesenthal. In fact, Simon Wiesenthal gave him a book, which I gave to my granddaughter on her bat mitzvah, which Simon Wiesenthal had drawn about the life and the sufferings in Mauthausen. Wiesenthal was an engineer from that area, and showing it. So one of the things that my stepfather experienced is walking, carrying these huge stones from the quarry. And at one of these occasions, he was struck with a truncheon on his nose by one of the guards, and his nose was broken. He could hardly breathe. He couldn't breathe. This was towards the end of the war. After the war, he testified at some of the war crimes trials of lower-ranking officials in Austria with Wiesenthal.
Wow.
And Wiesenthal, of course, stayed in Vienna. He became this famous Nazi hunter. But
In fact, I was just reading something today in I think it was the Washington Post, but not definitely the Washington Post, in which they talked about there's the trial of some. Now I'm trying to remember, but he's 100 years old, and he's being put on trial right now.
yeah.
I mean, it just shows that it's not about imprisoning someone. It's about just kind of the need
Oh, yes.
to communicate the illegality and the horror of what people were doing, even those lower ranking officials who were just following orders. Still, the horror of
Well,
what they
one of
could
the things that
contribute
my
to.
parents learned, and me too, is that the line between good and evil runs through every person's heart.
Yes.
And so there were good people, uh, you know, Polish, German. For example, my stepfather had his nose crushed and he couldn't breathe. And he went to a German, this is right after the liberation from Mauthausen. They were liberated by the American troops. And he went to this German surgeon and he said, the German surgeon said, I don't have any anesthetic. I can't do anything. My stepfather said, just do what you can. Let me breathe once, even if I die. And so he operated on him. His nose was always, crushed in afterwards, but he removed the bone, the cartilage, and he survived. And my stepfather thought so highly of him that when I had my tonsils removed at the age of 7, he had the same surgeon do that for me as well. So um, I did have one half traumatic experience at this DP camp in Bindermichel, and that was my stepfather became the director of a school, a Jewish school, and an orphanage, and they put on a Purim play, and I played Haman.
Hmm.
I assume that the language must have been Hebrew, but I don't recall what language it was. Anyway, I played Haman. My stepfather made a lovely costume and a beautiful sword, silver sword, that is a wooden sword painted in silver for me. And I delivered all of the lines absolutely perfectly. But there's one thing I hadn't learned which traumatized me. At the end of the performance, instead of bowing, like male actors are supposed to do, I curtsied. And so, as I had seen some girls do that, so I curtsied. And
Why?
that
Yeah.
experience probably destroyed my acting career. I didn't become a Dustin Hoffman or anyone else. So that's a traumatic experience that
You were just a
you know
kid
it,
and you
it
didn't know better.
soured me on acting,
I
soured
see.
me on the stage at all.
If that's
Um,
the most traumatic thing that happened to you while you were in a DP camp, then I think you had it good.
um, my mother had this brother-in-law in Palestine, but my parents, I guess, decided that they didn't want to. I can't remember why they chose to come to America, even though she had this brother-in-law and relatives in Palestine. Um, but I suspect it's sort of like Herzog, the character in Saul Bellows' novel. History was a kind of nightmare, and they came to America to get a good night's sleep. So what my parents said they put their finger. They also didn't want to go to a large city, and so they put their finger on a place with a nice lake. They put their finger on it, and they were the place was Sheboygan, Wisconsin, a small town about 60 miles north of Milwaukee.
Hmm.
And of course, they had to be sponsored by somebody. And this Jewish community in Sheboygan sponsored them.
That's beautiful.
Extraordinarily generous group. There were, I would say, there were about uh, not more than 300 families, maybe 250 Jewish families in Sheboygan. There were at that time 3 synagogues, but they were sponsored, and they sponsored about 25 other Jewish families, refugee families. In other words, they were responsible for them, for providing jobs, for making sure they would not be a charge on the public purse, and so on.
And what year
And
was this?
in 1949, so I said that's when we came to the United States in 1949.
So you watched the
And
establishment of Israel from a DP camp. I mean, if you could say you watched.
I imagine my parents did, and they continued to correspond with my uh, cousins, my uncle and aunt, for decades afterwards, weekly.
You know, I've been wanting to ask you before we get to Sheboygan.
Sure.
What I mean, any certainly we can agree that anybody who went through what you went through simply because you were a Jew had a Jewish identity. But you were working on false papers. You were communicating yourself to be a Christian, at least in you know as a way of personal protection and safety. Did you have any Jewish experiences, or was just who you were enough of a Jewish experience? Do you understand my question?
You mean before I came to,
America.
well, the Jewish experience would have been in the DP camp
Just
after the war.
what I'm saying is, so you played Haman or Haman. I see. In
Yes.
and there was there Jewish training that was happening in this camp? Were they teaching Hebrew? Or was it again just who you were that's kind of communicated your Jewish
Well,
background?
what I can say is that when we came to Sheboygan, I mean, my parents, there were 3 synagogues there. I will answer the question directly as best I can. There were 3 synagogues. My One of them was an Orthodox synagogue,
Hmm.
and my stepfather took me there a couple times. These were people who had come from the old shtetls, maybe in Russia and Poland a long time ago. But ultimately, we joined a conservative synagogue. Then there was a 3rd synagogue for all the people named Holman, Holman. But so there were 3 synagogues. We joined the conservative synagogue, which is still in existence.
Hmm.
And in training uh, for the bar mitzvah, um, the rabbi did not teach me the cantillation as you teach your students. I didn't learn the cantillation for the Torah and the Haftorah portion, but he helped me um, compose a speech in Hebrew. The topic of the speech was the degrees of charity as described by
Maimonides.
Maimonides.
Hmm.
And so I delivered that speech with his. I mean, I with his help. So I must have known some Hebrew at that point. I delivered the speech, and of course, nobody in the congregation of these. American Jews would have understood it, but the rabbi said to my mother that if I made any mistakes, she would have been certain to pick them up. She would have been certain to know that because her training had been in
Right.
Hebrew, and so I would say that my parents, I mean, for them, being Jewish was just like Yiddish. It's something that came from their background. They were
Right.
not, my mother and stepfather were not particularly religious.
Got it.
I think I am more interested in religion and its roots and the spiritual and historical elements than they were.
I see.
So we would celebrate Passover and Hanukkah and Purim, but not Shabbat. We did not celebrate Shabbat particularly.
I
It
understand.
was part of their culture, and I
Right.
think it's more than that for me. No.
Right. Well, and part of it, though, what I'm saying is so many people who went through those horrors, their instinct isn't to then to, and I'm not saying that there's a right or a wrong, but about people's instinct either to not necessarily make a big thing about it because it was that religion that was the core for so many of the struggles that they experienced over their lives. But let's get back to Wisconsin. Sheboygan.
Yes, yes.
You became a bar
And so my
mitzvah.
father, I had a bar mitzvah there. My mother started working in a hospital pharmacy,
Ah,
and then she had to take this 1 year. She got the certificate from her Polish professor. She had to take 1 year at the University of Wisconsin. She did extraordinarily well in the science classes, got along very well with the faculty, but she had to take a semester of history, American history, and a semester of political science, and she hated those. Um, she actually had me write her book reports and papers for the history class. And so I wrote them, and I was mad that I was a sophomore in high school, but I was mad I only got B's on the papers I wrote for her.
for
Anyway,
college.
she got her pharmacy degree. Meantime, my stepfather was working in a tool and he was working as a tool and die maker in a factory that made stainless steel ware. Um, he could hardly speak. He always had a strong accent to the very end of his life. And so this is right around the time, a little bit after the Korean War. The Korean War was still going on. And the owner of the factory came to the factory. This is just maybe 1953. And the owner his name was Walter Kohler. He was a liberal Republican governor of the state, not Herbert Kohler, not the one who organized the famous plumbing ware that you can buy here, but he was a liberal Republican. And he came to the factory and he said, look, we have an economic downturn, there's a recession going on here, and we have to cut back production. So there are two ways to do it. I can either lay off 20% of the workers, or you can keep everybody on and earn 20% less. And so the union had a meeting and they said, well, I guess the union leadership said the logical thing would be that the people who are laid off, at least they would have some kind of income, and the rest of us would have our full pay. And my stepfather, who at that point he must have spoken very little English, um, he got up and he said, and somehow he told the workers, the large group of workers, that that was true, provided that because they knew that the people who would be laid off were the people with the least seniority. And so they knew who would be laid off and who would stay on. And he said, that's unfair. If you do this as a lottery, then that would be just and fair. And he convinced them. And they decided to vote to work only 4 days a week to 4 out of 5 and accept lower pay and in order to keep the sense of collegiality together. Um, So I'm amazed at how he was able to do that, given that he spoke very little and he was
Right.
able to convince
And he was
convince them
able,
of
with
it.
his broken English, to be able
Yes,
to do
yeah,
it. That's
yes,
extraordinary.
yeah, yeah.
So keep going. So why don't we fast forward a little bit into where you how you are we able to fast forward a little bit?
I studied, so I went to started at the University of Wisconsin, and I started in chemistry. Actually, I went when my parents moved to Colorado. I transferred to the University of Colorado. I studied chemistry. I actually got several fellowships to. I could have gone pretty much to any school. I chose Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley for graduate school in chemistry. After
Wow.
2 years of chemistry of graduate school, I concluded that it wasn't really what I wasn't suited for it. Either I was not able enough, or it didn't meet my deepest emotional and intellectual needs, and I switched into history and political science. And my mother said that was one of the worst days of her life. Uh, it happens
Because
because
she was a pharmacist, and so she thought you were going into the family business,
uh, well,
so to speak.
she would have been she would have been happy to have me go into chemistry, into science. No, politics and history are the area of force and fraud, whereas science is true, science is objective, science
Yeah.
is valid.
Uh,
So she would have been very happy to have me go into any scientific field. And
by the way, this is in the mid to late '60s. Is that correct?
I I left Berkeley. I came back. I realized that I mean, I had not had a single course in political science or history at all,
Mhm.
and I um, decided that. So I applied to the University of Colorado, where I knew some people, and they said, "All right, take one semester and see if you can handle it, and then take the exams, and maybe you'll make it. Maybe we'll accept you." And so it worked out, and knowing the financial pressures on me and my parents, I uh, rushed through the uh, master's and doctorate programs, master's in 1 year and doctorate in another three. Um, and
That's amazing.
but I used some of my background on the master's program. I dealt with Polish foreign relations, and I used sources. And in fact, some of the sources were articles written by a writer for the Communist Party newspaper Tribuna Ludu. I later found out, I didn't know it, but I found out that he was the brother of my aunt in Israel.
Oh my God.
Um, so he stayed in Poland. He married a Polish woman. He stayed in Poland. He could never go to Israel. He could only meet them if they went to somewhere else in Europe on vacation, for example. And so, unbeknownst to me, I used his writings for one of the sources. And as far as the PhD work, I felt I had to use my science training, and so I did. My PhD dissertation dealt with science and ideology in the Soviet Union. So I didn't waste all of my science training. It came in to some degree handy.
And maybe
Um,
that at least made your mom a little happy.
yes, no, no, she gradually became reconciled to my choices. I mean, uh, yes, but the initial reaction was very negative. Anyway, um, so I want to mention something about my. I had seen my uncle and aunt once in the U.S., but I didn't see them in Israel until 1995. In 1995, my wife, this is my second wife, and I um, went to Israel, and uh, we were there for this is the only time I've ever been there, for maybe 10 days to 2 weeks. They took us to all over the southern part of the country. We stayed partly in Jerusalem in their homes, partly in Tel Aviv, partly in at the YMCA, near the King David Hotel, that old building. And I mostly wanted to spend time with them. And on the last day, my cousin's husband said he wanted to take us to a special restaurant. The restaurant was in a place called the American Colony. It's in East Jerusalem. And he said he invited all of the family in Jerusalem. Why don't we all go there? So my cousin's son was engaged to a very beautiful Yemenite Jewish woman, Abigail, and she said, "I'm a Jewish girl. Why would I want to go to this Arab restaurant?" And so she didn't go, and he didn't go either. But the rest of the family went. My uncle went, my aunt went, and here is this a beautiful. It used to belong to a landowner, or an Arab landowner, or a pasha, and then it was taken over by an American missionary group, and now it is a hotel. It's a sort of boutique hotel called the American Colony. Anyway, at the end of this wonderful meal, and walking through the various yards. By the way, my cousin's brother is a extraordinarily outgoing and charming, wide-ranging person with a sense of humor, but he also tips a lot. And so all of the waiters loved him, and they provided this wonderful food and such. I'll say something about him in a moment. Anyway, at the end, he said to he was afraid that my uncle and aunt would not want to go there. And he said, "Well, what do you think of this place, this American Colony?" And my aunt said, we've been here before. I've been here before. And the time that she had been there, she said she had gotten to be the head nurse at the emergency room at Hadassah, and King Abdullah of Jordan, before the establishment of the State of Israel, had invited all of the medical and nursing staff for celebration, for thanking the Hadassah Hospital for the medical care they provided. And so she had been there at the command of this original King Abdullah.
Wow.
Now, of course, King Abdullah was later assassinated in front of the Al-Aqsa Mosque. He was too moderate for the Arabs.
Right.
He was assassinated on the way to Friday prayer at the Al-Aqsa Mosque.
Wow.
And by an Arab extremist.
That was the father of King Hussein, right?
The father of King Hussein, yes, King Abdullah. He had wanted to negotiate with the Jews. He negotiated apparently once with Golda Meir, and he was just too moderate.
That is a great
story. Here we were in 1995, and I see these big signs in the city, and they say, Shalom Haver, Shalom Haver. And I'm wondering, what is this all about? And I asked, and it turned out that these were signs commemorating the killing of Yitzhak Rabin. Right. He had been killed in November of that year, and this was goodbye, comrade.
It's because those were the, it's because at King Hussein's funeral, or excuse me, at Rabin's funeral rather, that was what Bill Clinton said in his eulogy to about Rabin. He said Shalom Chaver, and so that became a bumper sticker, because of the friendship of Bill Clinton and Rabin. Anyway, keep going. Sorry for interrupting you.
See, just like Abdullah was killed by an Arab extremist for being too moderate, Rabin was killed by a fundamentalist right-wing Jewish a person for being too conciliatory to the Arabs. So,
right, he claimed that His name was Yigal Amir. He claimed that that Rabin was in essence coming to kill him because, and he was therefore working in self-defense because the policies of Rabin were enabling what he believed Arabs to put him in jeopardy. That's a terrible story of our people.
Yes.
But keep going
Yes.
anyway.
Yep.
So your first time in Israel was in
My first
1995.
and only time. My first and only time.
You have to get back because you
And
spent the whole time seeing your family. Do you still have family in Israel?
oh yes, see this brother-in-law. I'm sorry, not brother-in-law. My first
Cousin.
cousin's husband. He came to Israel in 1948 during the
War of Independence?
Independence War, and he stayed there. He fought and he stayed there. He's about 90 years old now. He
Wow.
fought and he stayed there. He was from South Africa.
Uh-huh.
By the way, his name is Brenner, and not no relation, I think, to the Joseph Haim Brenner, but his brother, another brilliant South African, went to um, was a molecular biologist and went to Cambridge, and uh, um, developed the human genome. He got a Nobel Prize in, I think, in 2002. Worked with Watson and Crick, first in Cambridge, then in Oxford. And he only died a couple of years ago working for the government of Singapore. So that's Sydney Brenner.
Wow.
And all of these South Africans, I'm amazed at how, you know, humorous and from that's true for my cousin's husband. I mean, just wide-ranging, humorous, raconteur, all kinds of stories, and I take it that's true for Sydney Brenner, and of course it's also true for that Aubrey guy who became Abba Eban, the other South
Right, of
African.
course.
Yeah,
Abba
uh,
Eban had a very good sense of humor. There's no doubt about it.
yeah, yeah.
Now, Yul
I
Brenner, on
should
the other
say
hand,
that yes,
no.
yes. That my uncle and aunt in Israel had the same reaction when one of my cousins left science in order to become an art therapist. They thought it was absolutely awful. In other words, all of the children became scientists or technologists, but they felt that leaving it and dealing with something in the humanities was there was something not quite kosher about it. They had the same attitude towards non um, towards the non-objective world, the world of politics, the world of history, and such.
Right. It's like make a living, not just conversation topics.
Yes, yes, I guess so. Yeah, yeah.
So tell me a little bit more. Well, you can go in any direction you want to, but if you need me to push you in a direction, like I want to hear about uh, what your Jewish experiences were like as was your first job teaching at Michigan State, or did you or you,
Yes, that's my. Well, I taught uh, as a graduate student at the University of Colorado, but yes, Michigan State.
and was
Yes.
it political science that you were teaching, or was it history, or both?
Social science,
Social
an
science.
interdisciplinary course in social science. It included social science, political science, some economics as well. Yes.
And so I
I
mean, and
stayed
when
there
you were
for 40
living, so
years.
did you belong to a synagogue in East Lansing?
Yes, we belonged to a Reconstructionist synagogue.
Wow.
Reconstructionist synagogue. There was another synagogue which I guess the most of the middle class people belonged to. But the Reconstructionist synagogue had some people who were extraordinarily well educated. They were able to lead the prayers. They did not have a rabbi until pretty late, until several years after the synagogue was established.
And now
Yeah.
for my second attempt at Jewish geography. The first one having been when I brought up Dr. Joseph Thaler, who just came from the same hometown of Vov as you did. My second one is that we had a student cantor at our synagogue for 2 years, who I care for quite deeply. His name was, he is now Cantor Josh Breitzer. He was just at the time student cantor Breitzer, but Josh Breitzer's father taught at Michigan State also, and Josh grew up in East Lansing. There, I'm trying to remember. Oh no, maybe Josh's father was a pediatrician and his mother taught at Michigan State. Now I'm having a hard time remembering which was which, but nonetheless, Cantor Breitzer was who's cherished person in our synagogue's history. It was also a resident of East Lansing for the first, I suspect, 18 years of his life. Nonetheless, so you the Reconstructionist synagogue. And how often did you go? And was Judaism a part of your family life, or was it you just kind of went to synagogue every once in a while?
Well, my son studied it for his
Bar
and had his bar mitzvah there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I should anticipate that. I mentioned before that I was talking about my second wife going to Rome and also to Israel. My first marriage ended in divorce after 21 years. I was married for 27 years to my second wife, whom I had known for years before. She was Catholic. She was sort of a symbol of Vatican II in her view. But we celebrated Jewish holidays. We celebrated Christmas, having a Christmas tree and such. We celebrated Passover and Hanukkah, and we were. So rather than Judaism being something that is just part of the folkways and food, I think we were both extraordinarily interested in religion. And so there was, we actually had a interfaith wedding, but the ketubah, which we helped write, was combined aspects of both traditions. And so she was extraordinarily supportive of that, and I was supportive of her traditions as well.
It's if you take away the ritual, then what? And you just study the New Testament and read the New Testament, it really can be a very meaningful and eye-opening text for a Jew is to read the New Testament, the Christian Bible. Once you place the dogma and, well, I'd say the catechism of the Catholic Church, but just the religion and the observance, that's when Christianity and Judaism go in separate directions. But the Christian Bible itself can be a very meaningful and helpful and interesting text when it comes to our own Judaism. It certainly helps us understand the times, a very important time, the rabbinic period, the early rabbinic period of Judaism. So I'm a student of the New Testament myself.
I'm also interested in other religions because this is the way that people have encountered the divine. So
right.
I want, that's the only way to understand them. If I can bring something up to date as to why I'm happy to be in Annapolis. Mm-hmm. So on one occasion, my wife and I had a Seder, and there happened to be a conference on race at Michigan State University. And two of the speakers who were there were Haynes Walton and Robert Smith. They had written a book called I think that it was called African Americans and the Universal Quest for American Politics, African Americans and the Universal Quest for Freedom. So we invited them for a Seder,
Mm-hmm.
and they came to the Seder. And Walton was a professor at the University of Michigan. He was a leftist, a liberal, non-religious. Robert Smith was quite religious. He's at San Francisco State University. And Mary Lou and I went and stayed with him later, or had him went to see him for dinner when we were at Berkeley later on. Anyway, one of the things that I learned from these, from by the way, both Mary Lou and I used this book as one particular course. Anyway, um, one of the things that I learned and why I'm very happy to be here in Annapolis is the extraordinary degree to which all of the freedoms which Americans, all of us, have are due to the African American struggle for their own freedom. In other words, for example, Walton and Smith describe, for example, how the 14th Amendment, uh, the liberty and equality, equal treatment and such, that the Bill of Rights was originally not um, applicable to the states. It was only applicable to the federal government. So, for example, even such simple things as the right of a married couple to use contraceptives was against the law in many states. It was the case of Griswold versus Connecticut, I think in the early 1960s, which first made this a constitutional right. And the way they did it is that they brought the 14th Amendment and they said the life, liberty, and equal treatment of the law, which was written to protect the newly freed slaves, applies to all people.
Right.
In other words, that this is part of what liberty means in the liberties in the Bill of Rights.
Mm-hmm.
And so here in Maryland, I see this in a way that I didn't always see it in Wisconsin. I should say that when I was going to school in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, I think there was only one black family in the whole city,
Wow.
and they were in the other high school, not in the high school I went to. But every single teacher that I had was extraordinarily, I mean, they emphasized equality. They praised the Brown versus Board of Education. They were really for equal treatment. And so it shocked me many years later when I found out that George Wallace got maybe 40% of the vote in the county when
Yeah.
he ran for president. And so I never experienced this in going to school, and yet that racism must have existed there, um, not in the education that I learned, but must have existed there. So
Right.
when I come to Maryland and I see, you know, the long, the role of African Americans in the struggle for freedom, and uh, I'm this is something that I find very moving and
Meaningful, right? Touching, yeah,
meaningful
moving.
to me. Yes.
Yeah, I mean
And as
Frederick
far as
Douglass and
yes,
the
Harriet Tubman,
right.
Frederick Douglass, absolutely.
And Annapolis
And
certainly does bring out that history in a very meaningful way. Why don't we? We've been talking, and I've kept you for a long time, but I want to
yes,
like just maybe fast forward to the last couple years. Tell me
yes.
about or about how Judaism has kind of emerged in your life at this point, this stage of your life.
Um, the congregation here, Temple Beth Shalom, I mean, I've encountered so many people who share my interests. For example, I really, uh, in all of the congregations that I went to before, music was never a large part of it. And so having the music for whenever Nashira performs or when you have the um, Annapolis Chorale or such for the high holiday services, it is absolutely emotionally very moving. The Torah study groups in which you go into depth in terms of discussions of passages in the Bible, they speak a great deal to me. Um, and so I learned from other people such as Paul Schatzberg, or, there are various people that I learn a great deal from, and there's a kind of emotional connection. So it's not just intellectual, there is a kind of um, a collegiality and friendship. And of course, I learned an enormous amount from your various discussions about Talmud and uh, books that you discuss. So
Well,
yes,
but
it's
to be
been
perfectly honest, I
it's
have to
been
just
a
kind of pass
recovery.
along the compliment, and that is, on a number of occasions I have remembered, like over the last couple of years, it's probably been like now 4 years or so, but like I can remember after a class, you would then say you would email me with a 3-page dissertation. You said you didn't really want to bring this up, but you wanted to share some ideas and thoughts with me, and I would say, "Oh my God, this is fantastic what you've written here," to the point where I think I said, "You must start talking in class. This is too interesting."
Well, um, I don't have to. I mean, many people have to work. I don't have to work. I'm retired. Uh, I'm sort of a Zoomer That's the Yiddish expression for a butterfly. I can experience all of the, traditions and beauty. And Zoom sessions have been extraordinarily helpful in broadening my perspective.
Do you think a Zoomer Fagala was
Zoomer.
do you think that they or Fagel? Do you think that they knew they were prescient to some degree and knew that that was going to have something to do with Zoom and Zoom technology? So
Well,
you got well.
yes.
So you know what I mean. We have been talking for a while, and I something tells me this is going to be a very popular YouTube. Uh, I, I have to tell. There's so much more obviously you could say, and what you're gonna do is you're gonna say to me down the line, oh my God, because this is what everyone says. I wish I had neglected to talk about this. I neglected to talk about that, and this was never meant to be an exhaustive conversation. This is always meant to just be just like an opportunity to hear your story and to hear your experiences. For that matter, I can't deny to document it also in a very in a it's permanent. It's well, so long as YouTube's permanent, I suppose. But but it's permanent just because your story is extraordinary. Your experiences are extraordinary. You as a human being are extraordinary, and we and we're just so fortunate to be able to have these opportunities to hear your stories. And I think it makes us all and to this day, people who I wish I could tell you just how many people send me a text or an email afterwards saying, "Oh, I just listened to the interview. It was really, and something tells me I'm going to have a bunch of emails and texts about this one." That it's just so helpful to us to just hear your story and to just feel like raised as a result of it. So Jim, I got to tell you, and I know, we didn't even get to everything, but I thank you so much for taking this time to talk and to hear your story. And I know to some degree you were a little hesitant to share it, but I'm so glad in the end you did because I'm a better person having just listened to it, to be perfectly
Well,
honest.
it is not as scary as I thought it would be. Uh, my last conclusion, though,
Go ahead.
from my life, is that I take it, let's say, from Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the line between good and evil runs through every person's heart. It is not us against them. It is there's good and evil, and we have to choose between them in our lives.
Yeah.
And so, even though I started out with real traumas at the beginning, I am not, devastated by them.
Yeah, and you
I look
experienced a
more at
number of
the
good people too along the way that helped you and that helped you become the person you are and helped you bring you to this place. So yeah,
I look more at the joy of Judaism as opposed to the oi.
Yeah. And now that you're in Annapolis, it's the ahoy of Judaism. So anyway, I thank you so much, and I thank anyone who has been watching and listening to this. And just as a little bit of a plug, if anyone who is watching, or you, for that matter, you too, Jim, have a suggestion of a person you'd like to see me talk to, and then please reach out to me so I can learn about these people and reach out and maybe set up another conversation just like this. Jim, bravo. Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank
Be
you.
well, my friend.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay, so